It may be a cozy little thing today. That's just fine.
That's all right.
There's a lot going on in the archives. A lot going on for Historic Preservation Month. Was at a thing at Historic Brookstown last night about historic hotels, which was a lot of fun. Talking about the buildscape of the city's past. And I guess we'll go on and get started. Since we're an informal group, and
That's right. People
I
can
may
wander
float
in.
more, excuse me on the camera, but
Yep.
I may float more. But I wanted to give you kind of an overview. I had this title, and I had that title in search of something, because I wanted to talk about that. So if this talk is a little bit of this and that, it's because that was what was in my brain, thinking of this and that. All right, so I wanted to give you a little heads up on that. When I title about a talk, Archival Resources for Historic Preservation, I'm thinking here at this archive, and so here's what you're going to hear about today. You cannot talk about Old Salem without talking about this place. So we'll give a little review of how Old Salem came to be thanks to this place. How do you know, how did they know, how do you know what's here for your research, whether it's for historic preservation or anything else? I'll give you a little heads up for that. The National Register research, this is a Historic Preservation Month, so to give you a little insight into the kinds of information that people are looking for when they're looking to do research in historic preservation, just run through a little bit about that. And talking about one of our board members, recently added board member Heather Fernbach, and her recent research came out a couple of years ago about the buildscape in Forsyth County. And a couple of unique resources here at the archives, the Fogel Brothers records, some of our maps, our photos, and the latest historic preservation restoration challenge, Hidden Town. Just give you sort of an update of where things are in our conversation about that. A great read to go over the early days of Old Salem is Francis Griffin's book, An Adventure in Historic Preservation. And it was an adventure to get from before there was a reserved, old, and historic Salem district in 1948. The buildscape was a motley assortment of industrial and business and residential here before 48. And then after the zoning, this was all reserved to be residential. So there was a vision involved. Francis spells out some of the steps in that. Over Barbara's right shoulder is a picture of Arthur Spa, who in 1938 had a conversation with Charlie Babcock and said, we need to preserve some of these old homes. We need a concerted effort because they're going to go away. And there had been threats to individual buildings. In the 20s, somebody wanted to buy Salem Tavern, which had been historically, of course, a hotel, was a residence, and they wanted to buy it, turn it to commercial purposes. The local resident said, no, I'm going to buy it, and she and her sisters moved into the place. Well, that's an individual saving a place, but there was no strategy for saving the buildscape of the Moravians' heritage that was here. The war intervened in that conversation, and then after the war, there was not much going on in building. There was no real threats to Old Salem, but everybody could see what was coming at the end of the war. Everybody was going to come back with money. They wanted to build. There was an explosion of interest in building, and city leaders said, we need to have a better handle overall about zoning. And part of that enabled the conversation about zoning for a special reserve district for Old Salem to enter into the conversation. So in 48 and 49, there was efforts to research what that might look like. It was spurred in part by a threat in July of 47. You've heard about the grocery store that was going to move in right next to the oldest building in town, the fourth house that was built in Salem. That just did not set well, and then it motivated people to put a fine point on how can we do a historic preservation effort. In March of 16th of 50, you see this assembly of the first Board of Trustees of Old Salem Incorporated. Whole names that resonate throughout the history of the city for their business and community leadership. They were integral to the founding of this place. 48, 49 are interesting times. 49 was the centennial of Forsyth County. The head of the Centennial Celebration Committee was a younger version of James A. Gray. He was partly responsible for this Bushmaster Parade, where everybody was growing their beards in honor of the centennial. Folks who wouldn't normally have a beard, they wanted to get that 19th century look. All sorts of fun going on. I love Francis's description of the year 49. It's up here. It says, this was the year, too, in which the Arts Council was organized. It was the year that liquor stores were voted in. Plainly, Winston-Salem was a year of looking forward and backward one at the same time. So, liquor stores probably fueled the inspiration for Bushmasters for that. So, for all I know. 48, 49 was also the last year that we had Adelaide Freeze with us. She was working hard on a volume that would celebrate the county's history. Forsyth County on the March, which had a later edition in the 70s, which made it much more scholarly and much more dry, frankly. This was a fun read. It was a compilation. But in that last year, she got to meet a young fella. This is the older version of Frank Horton. Frank was inspired by this talk about saving old Salem. His family was in the antiques business, and so they were anxious to be in the conversation of preserving the landscape. He got to know Adelaide Freeze, and he went and looking at the stuff that she had in the archives back when it was over on the Forstater building off Bank Street. He found this map from 1799, and it had a little light go off in his head. He says, "Didn't we keep records like of taxes paid and things like that?" And Adelaide Freeze would say, "Well, I guess we did." So here's a listing of taxes paid. And lo and behold, they realized that they had a wonderful resource of who owned what property where. They could actually track buildings. This is back to 1821. And it lists the houses and the lots of Salem. And lo and behold, they realized that even as late as 1950, that half of the buildscape from 1821 was still on the ground. An amazing number. But it wasn't going to stay there without concerted effort. So 1950 was the year that they formalized an agreement with the archives. The Old Salem trustees got together. They started copying items that were in our archive for use in the restoration of Old Salem. What kind of things did they copy? Let's see. How would they know what to copy? Maps, tax lists, town lot lists, diaries, All-Stayer Palladium minutes, and gobs of other things. It comes to find out that in the 1940s, 42 to be exact, Adelaide Freeze, as part of a Works Project Administration program, cataloged what she had of the Moravian archives. The catalog, sad to say, is still the only online reference you have for finding out what's in our place. We're going to work on that. That's one of our to-do projects, longer term. But it's a way that they got a handle of the baskets of stuff that were available here for research. Here's a listing in this online guide, which you can still go to. By the way, if you'll go to our website, we have a link to that catalog now on our website, so you can actually see from your home the kinds of things we have here in some detail. So here's a collection of the All-Stayer Palladium minutes. The 50 agreement with the archives, and then what happened in the 60s, there was a broader, the Old Salem was a one-off. To ensure it long-term, it was part of a national conversation about the need for historic preservation sponsorship efforts across the country. In 65, there was state legislation to empower local districts, local municipalities to have historic preservation commissions. In 66, there was the National Historic Preservation Act, and the National Registry of Historic Places started. And so a local historic review commission started also in 1966. What does it take to be on the National Register of Historic Places? Well, criteria for evaluation: quality of significance in American history, architecture, archaeology, engineering, and culture is present in this particular place. That has to be a given, and either the place must be associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history, or the place must be associated with the lives of persons significant in their past, or the place must embody a distinctive characteristic of the type, period, or method of construction from that time period, or must be a place that has yielded or may be likely to yield important information in history or prehistory. Ordinarily, religious areas are left out of that unless there is some additional historical import. That was an easy case to make for Salem. It was central, it was the frontier town for North Carolina. It was crucial to the history of North Carolina commerce, North Carolina's development. It wasn't just a Moravian story. There are currently more than 90,000 properties listed in the National Register, representing 1.4 million individual resources, including buildings and sites, districts, structures, and objects. Almost every county in the U.S. has a place listed in the National Register. If you're in West Texas, my apologies. Apparently that seems to be the only place where we're lacking. You can go online to the National Park Service's National Register website and actually drill down and see the information about our local historic districts. Historic districts are the big blocks in red. Here you see I've highlighted the Old Salem district. And then individual houses, which are labeled as landmarks or National Register sites, show up in little orange gold dots. Here's a form for applying to be a National Register place. What do they ask you on this form? Well, other than identifying what it is, and there's the criteria and the considerations that may be against you getting it, like being a religious institution or having been greatly altered or being a cemetery or being just a commemorative object. You have to write a narrative description of the reasons why this place is important. What's in that description? It's a summary paragraph that briefly describes the general characteristics of the property, such as its location, setting, type, style, method of construction, size, and significant features. It describes the current condition of the property, indicates whether the property has historic integrity, hasn't been changed a lot, in terms of location, design, setting, and materials. Now, I'm going to go back because there's a quote about historic integrity that I think is important. It's on the right here from Frank Horton. And there was in the early days this temptation to, what does it mean to be a historic district? What does it mean to fix something up historically? Preservation is not the same as renovation. Okay? Read this paragraph here. It's increasingly my attention that there is a lack of understanding regarding the work in Salem, particularly this one house that got him ticked off when he wrote this memo. The attitude has changed from one of preservation to one of renovation. It should be our aim to preserve an old part of a building rather than repair it, to carefully repair an old part rather than restore it, and to restore an old part rather than to substitute some new design or present-day thinking. It was intentional that when they built the Visitor Center and Mesta in the midst of Old Salem, they did not want it to mimic Old Salem stylistically. They wanted to clearly be visibly different from the old buildscape. That's an intentional choice, so that you know the difference between a preservation effort and something new. So much for that. This is the kind of details. This is a description on the left for Cedarhurst, which has a very thorough description. It's wonderful. In fact, the descriptions in these historic register documents were a great source material for me when I did a book on the history of West End, because it gave me the stories that were connected with the property, the family names that were connected with the property. And so when I went looking to do a picture book out of nothing, which is what that was, I started going in the city phone book and looking at the family names and see if the same families might have been around. And lo and behold, a large number were. A large number had wonderful photographs, never been seen by anybody outside the family. And a third of that book is family photographs that I was happy to collect and pass on for other folks. There's a lot of resources there in those National Register nominations. Heather Fernbach did a great service for our community by putting together in 2016, I think was when this was published, a book called Winston-Salem's Architectural Heritage, where she combined a lot of the previously individual district information, consolidated into a citywide description of all the buildscape, added some other materials. Kind of a sad thing, Gwen Taylor had done this back for the West End Historic District where I used to live. It was a source for me. And she had done an earlier version of this county history in a book called From Frontier to Factory. And what she said that Heather discovered is that in 2006, when she started this thing, she discovered that almost 30% of the historic structures mentioned in the earlier book had disappeared. So just because you record it doesn't mean it's going to be preserved. But I will say, from a historian standpoint, it does preserve it in our imagination, in our recapturing of a vision of what earlier generations had for our place. It's really a wonderful synopsis of different neighborhoods. You can go in and read house-by-house descriptions in that same level of detail that you get in the individual historic guides. And we've got a copy on the table. You're welcome to browse through afterwards. Where does she get all this information? She has a wonderful source right here at the Moravian Archives. The inside covers of her book are out in the hallway. You can go take a look at these after our talk today. 2 panoramas from 1914. I think this must be taken on top of the old Wachovia building on 3rd Street, looks like, from being the courthouse right there in front. That's looking north. The other one's looking south of what the world looked like in Forsyth County. One fun thing to do is drill down, and you can on your computer zoom in and in great detail. There's a young fellow walking on the street right here. You zoom in on your computer, you can read them in great detail because the camera apertures let in so much information in those cameras back in the day. When you zoom them up on the computer, it's really wonderful to look at. There's a lot of photographic records in our collection. And what was a great help to her, and I'll mention in passing since I put this here, I knew about the records of one business that was here. That was the Freeze family when I did work on the Brookstown Hotel. I did not know about the great resource with the Fogel Brothers. The Fogel Brothers, 2 sons of Augustus Fogel, who was a true Moravian craftsman. He was a furniture builder in the mid-19th century. In his younger days, in 38, he and his buddy, Mr. Severs, went over to Thomas Day's furniture shop in Milton. Thomas Day was a free African-American who had probably the most well-regarded furniture-making shop in certainly the Southeast and one of the top ones in the country. And they honed their skills further in their time there. Came back here in 1870. Augustus, who lived in East Winston, let his sons have some land on what's now Ballou Street. Well, it was Ballou Street. I'm not sure what it's called now because the site has actually been paved over by Business 40. But they had this large lumber yard, planing mill, and what they soon discovered is that they had a great business to be in as a town was booming from almost nothing to a wonderfully sized Winston-Salem. In 1870, we had about 450 folks who were living here. Within 20 years, it was 7,000. There was a boom town, and people needed a place to stay. And guess what? You didn't have a Lowe's, you didn't have a Home Depot, but you had Fogel Brothers. And Fogel Brothers, with that craft skill tradition, married with the new technologies that enable folks to produce wood products in a faster way, were in a sweet spot in the market. When I was doing my research on West End and looking at things like the Poindexter House, which has now been moved from its old home on 4th Street over to West End Boulevard, all those beautiful, fancy, ornate Queen Anne Victorians, you don't realize it, but from a woodworking standpoint, they were only possible and only made in such large number through the use of standardized moldings and standardized doodads, things that the Fogel Brothers were just churning out. And that's how we had such a wonderful kind of porch work that cost a pretty penny to do nowadays, but that was what the materials were here for. That's what this company was in business to do. One of the smart things the Fogel Brothers did was they would finance. It's a picture of the firm. They originally had a wooden shed. By 1890, they moved to a new brick building. Here's some of the folks who were in the company. The town was growing so fast, what they would do is not just sell you the lumber. They started having their own general construction. They were contractors. They would go out and help you build the place. And so in order to finance a growing region, they also let people pay on time. They have wonderful, as a result, wonderful records. The company was in business from 1870 to 1988. At the end of the time of the business, they gave all those records for all those years. All that boomtown work is in our archive below. It's quite a lot of stuff. If you're not familiar with red rot, that's what happens when a leather book starts to go. Well, come, let me show you the Fogel Brothers collection. There's a little bit of red rot on the outside of it. But it's a great resource, and the details are fascinating. If you're looking at researching individual property for one of these historic preservation nominations, we've got details Here's a listing of some of the properties the company owned. But in the ledgers, here's one from 1893, they have a listing of all the folks for whom they did work for. Individual property owners and the jobs they did it. And they have an itemized listing of everything they sold or did. Here's for P.H. Haynes, the big tobacco company at the time. Lots and lots of stuff. Asked Heather, have they done anything on the Hotel Zinzendorf, which is fine to me because I wrote that West End book about it with the macho guy standing in front of the Zinzendorf. Lo and behold, it's not listed as Hotel Zinzendorf, it's listed as West End Land Company, and there in 1891 is a list of items they supplied for the Hotel Zinzendorf. Kind of cool. Clearly from the number, they were not the main contractor, but they supplied a number of the materials that were used in building that place. What kind of structures did the Fogel Brothers build? Look at the buildscape that's still around. The Arista Mill, the Blair House, the Carnegie Library, Cedarhurst, the home of the Southern Province, the Fritz Hentz House, the Christ Moravian Church, Fogel Flats up here at the edge of Salem Cemetery. One of my favorites, several big houses with the Freeze family, several big houses on Kent Road. One of my favorites is this house. This is the J.W. Freeze house right there. This is Cherry Street back in the day before paving. Cherry Street was the main street for the money folks in the first boom in the 1880s. Then it turned and went down 4th Street as they started building out. And by the 20s, it became all those baronial estates, Granola, Grayland, Tanglewood. You watch the moneyed folks moving out and their buildings following. All these records are here in our place. Now, we do have a bunch of wonderful maps. Our Cartographic Collection, I grew up loving maps. I really love working at this place. There's some wonderful maps. Reuter is drool-worthy every time you look at it. Here's the first map of Salem, the layout of Salem in 1766. We've got Salem maps for a long way through. Here's 1805. Here's, let's see. Here's back up a bit, slow down. 1876, the Vogler map showing Salem and Winston, just again as the towns were sprouting and growing. A popular map for genealogical research is the Miller map, which shows in some great detail out in the county individual homeowners and where they lived on these outlying roads. Now, I'm familiar with the Miller map. I didn't realize there was one in Forsyth County until I started doing genealogical research for others here. In my own family history research, we come from Union County, and the Miller folks did a similar map in Union County. And lo and behold, it was quite easy to understand why my great-great-grandmother and great-great-grandfather got together. Because they were next-door neighbors back in the day. The Tarletons and the Simpsons. Well, no wonder you're just courting up the street. That's how you learn. You get a little information sideways about things. But from a historic preservation standpoint, one of the things that's interesting for our group, let's see, we got a little response there from the phone?
See if your battery's running low.
Is it getting low? Okay. Can you pop it more for me?
What's the date?
There we go. All right. The E.A. Vogler map from 1863. This map, if you go downstairs on your way out today, it's right next to our reading room entrance. It's got so much information on it, we really can't put it in an accessible digital form to give you the whole thing. It's very dense. We've done on our reading room computers, we carve it up into sections because, whenever it wants to go over it, the information, what this is Vogler in 63. The church had gotten out of running Salem as a community, and what they have done here is itemize where all the parcels in Wachovia outside of Salem, who actually owned them by 1863. So again, like with the Miller map, later, we have folks who are interested in genealogy that come see, oh, I see why my great-great-great got together with this great-great-great. They were neighbors. Information you could not see quickly unless you had it in a visual, accessible form. But it's also good for putting in that historic narrative paragraph. If you've got a property out in the county, we can help teach you a little bit more about properties. Even though you may not be Moravian, you may not be connected to the church, we have resources here for folks who are interested in Forsyth County. There we go, there's some of the detail. And that's the zoomed in map. It's You have to get in even closer on our computer to figure it out. When I was working on the Zinzendorf, I got this wonderful photograph at Old Salem. Got several great photographs at Old Salem. Here's one I got from here, a close-up of the opening of the hotel in May of 1892. And of course, this famous one that Tom Hagee took of the Zinzendorf on fire in November. What I could not find, and what's very difficult to find in general, is interior photos, just in general. Photos of buildings we've got out the wazoo. Photos of folks inside are hard to find. Richard Starbuck, bless his heart, had a suggestion for me. He said, look at this scrapbook. And it was a family scrapbook from the Peterson family. And there, lo and behold, is a photo marked from the old Zinzendorf. And this was said in 1906, time the new Zinzendorf was opening up. And I knew from the look out of the land and how the woman was dressed, this was an interior photo of that old hotel. Kind of cool to see. When I was looking to prepare for today, I was excited to see that we had in one of our ephemera collections a card that purported to be the menu of the last meal served at the Hotel Zinzendorf. That got me thinking, ooh, I'd like to see that. If you read carefully, this is the original way that the Zinzendorf presented its meals, with that logo, which I had not seen before, and that hotel. And it said, this is from a printing company on 4th Street. Burned entirely down on Thursday morning, November 24th, 1892 at 10:30 while Thanksgiving dinner was being prepared. The menu for that banquet would have been printed on this card, which is now presented to you as a souvenir with best wishes for a happy and prosperous 1903. Pretty cool. Would you find that online? Probably not. We don't get that level of detail. But it's the kind of resources that over 250 years of collecting and putting away things you can find here at the Moravian Archives, which may or may not have anything to do with Moravian history, but are a great resource for folks who are interested in finding history. Now, what's the latest historic preservation restoration effort that we're working with? We're working with Martha Hartley here, and we're trying to find on the ground locations where there might be slave dwellings when African Americans enslavement was part of the culture here. And what's difficult, of course, is that the way the ownership of slaves was not like it was in other places. For many years, all slaves were owned by the central church, and they were sort of almost like a rental basis. You get them for a season, for a project. There's a lot of transition. The number of places where you might actually have a house may be a limited number. Most people that had African Americans living with them were ones and twos, probably domestic help. But there's several places that they've identified as likely because of the numbers and because of hints that are in the records that we might be able to find a location for where a slave quarters was. And so we're looking at a number of resources here. You see the list on the right of things that they're checking, and we're going to be adding some other possible sources of information. But almost all of these